Hello, my name is April Lindberg. I'm from Michigan State. I grew up in the Detroit area, and I'm here today to talk about my experience growing up deaf in a hearing family. Growing up, it was just my mother and myself. She was a single mother, and to communicate, we would point at things and gesture, but we really didn't use a true language. One day, my mother and I were in the kitchen. I was around 3 years old, and I was on the floor playing, and my mother was at the stove cooking, making lots of noise with the pots and the pans. All of a sudden, she accidentally dropped one of the pots on the floor, and naturally it made a really loud noise. I continued to play. I didn't react to the noise, and my mother noticed this and realized something was wrong. It wasn't right that I didn't react to such a loud noise. So my mother took me to a doctor, and he performed a hearing test and determined that I was deaf. My mother was completely baffled, and she became very upset. She's a hearing person who had no experience with the deaf community, and she did not know how to meet my needs. She asked the doctor, "What do I do? How do I meet my daughter's needs? Do I send her to a special school? What do I do?" The doctor suggested she enroll me in a preschool program. So she decided to look in the local area, and I grew up in the Grosse Pointe area, and I was the only deaf child in that town. So it wasn't a surprise when I started the preschool program in town, and I was the only deaf student. All of the other students there were hearing. The teacher there struggled to communicate with me. She would try to gesture, but it really didn't work out, and eventually she informed my mother that this was not the right program for me. I was the only deaf child among all of these hearing students, and I was too much of a burden. My mother was at a loss and tried to explain how there were different ways she can try to communicate with me, but eventually she transferred me to a different program. After trying my third or fourth program, my mother found the Detroit Day School for the Deaf. This was a much better situation for me. I really thrived at this school. And finally, probably at about the age 7, I had developed language. It was an American Sign Language that's used by the deaf community, but it was Sign Exact English. Before that, it was really difficult for my mother and I to communicate. We would try to gesture back and forth, but we suffered from a lot of communication breakdown. Finally, age 7, my mother and I began to learn Sign Exact English together, and we could finally communicate. When I graduated from the Detroit Day School for the Deaf, I went to the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, which is a residential high school housed on the campus of Gallaudet University, the only deaf university in the world. And I absolutely loved it there. I was fully immersed in the deaf community, and I quickly learned American Sign Language, and it was great. When I went home to visit my mother, she didn't expect such a change in me. She was used to using Sign Exact English, and I was now using American Sign Language. She had to ask me to slow down so she can understand, and I had to explain that this was my new culture. I found my identity as a deaf person. In the past, I was embarrassed to identify as a deaf person. I would use the term hard of hearing, and I would swear how I could do all of the things hearing people could do. I could hear, I could talk, I could listen to music, because I was embarrassed to be deaf. But once I got to the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, that completely changed. I learned American Sign Language, and I realized that I was a deaf woman. So that was my experience growing up deaf in a hearing family, and I want to thank you for listening.